At age 52, Terrell Owens stands among the greatest wide receivers in NFL history, not through emotional praise, but through cold, indisputable numbers. Over 15,900 receiving yards, more than 150 touchdowns, ranking near the top of all time in the most important categories for the WR position. That's not a fleeting explosion, but a dominance that stretched across multiple different eras of football. Owens shone with the San Francisco 49 eras, exploded with the Philadelphia Eagles, and continued to leave his mark with the Dallas Cowboys, despite high-pressure, controversial environments. He was a six-time Pro Bowl selection, multiple-time All-Pro, a constant nightmare for opposing defenses, a player who could change the course of a game with one perfect route and one contested catch in tight coverage. His most iconic peak came in Super Bowl 39, when Owens returned to play just weeks after a serious injury, still making catches, still making an impact, still proving he belonged on the biggest stage in American football. His induction into the Pro Football Hall of Fame was not a favor. It was a long overdue recognition of a career where talent, power, and will far exceeded any initial doubts. But behind those glittering achievements lies a quiet, persistent pain that never appears in the stat sheets. Owens carried a sense of abandonment from very early on, and when he entered the NFL, that feeling didn't disappear, it simply changed shape. The better he became, the more he was scrutinized, the more he stood out, the more he was labeled as uncontrollable. There was no farewell game, no moment where history embraced him fully. Owens left the NFL in silence, as though years of dedication could be pushed aside simply because he didn't fit the likable mold. The greatest pain for Terrell Owens was not the injuries or the controversies, but the constant need to prove his worth to a world that seemed to always doubt him. And it was precisely in that adversity that Owens's will shone brightest. He didn't collapse, he didn't disappear, he didn't deny who he was just to be accepted. At age 52, he still trains, still maintains discipline, still stands tall with his own legacy. History may not have fully embraced him, but Owens chose not to turn his back on himself. A quiet, painful, and deeply respectable form of resilience. If you want to keep listening to the story behind Terrell Owens's spotlight, where glory couldn't erase the loneliness, please hit subscribe to join us for the next part. Thank you for staying with us until this moment, and we'll see you in the next installment, when the real wounds of a legend begin to be revealed. Terrell Owens didn't enter life with the foundation of a family. From before he was old enough to understand what love meant, he lived in a state of absence that no one ever explained to him. His biological father was absent from every childhood memory, no pictures, no voice, no moment of goodbye or promise to return. That absence wasn't loud or dramatic, it was silent and endless, like a bottomless void. For a child, the most terrifying thing isn't being yelled at, it's not being called by name, not being chosen to stay. Terrell grew up with a question that was never answered. Why wasn't he enough for a father to stay? His mother, a single woman, tried to do everything she could. She loved her son. There's no denying that. But love under exhausting circumstances often looks more tired than protective. Caught between the pressure of survival and her own loneliness, she couldn't give Terrell the one thing he needed most in those early years, the feeling of being fully held, of being told that his existence mattered even when he did nothing at all. In that house, there were no long stretches of warm laughter, no evenings where a child was asked, "Are you okay today?" There was care, but not full presence. And for Terrell, that absence slowly became a normal part of life, a thing he learned to accept before he could understand how deeply it had hurt him. Terrell grew up feeling like no one ever truly chose him. At school, he wasn't the first kid noticed. In relationships, he was usually the one who had to try harder to be seen. No one ever said outright that he didn't matter, but no one said he was enough either. That silence was the deepest cut. It taught Terrell a brutal lesson very early. If he didn't stand out, if he didn't make noise, he would fade from people's view. And for a child who had already been left behind, fading meant being abandoned all over again. There was no embrace long enough to shape Terrell Owens's personality. There were no unconditional affirmations that he was loved simply for being himself. Instead, he learned to build his own worth through action. He learned that he had to run faster, get stronger, shine brighter to be noticed. Every unanswered silence, every brushed aside emotion, made Terrell withdraw and silently promise himself it wouldn't happen again. He began to tie his existence to his ability to draw attention. If people looked toward him, that meant he was still there. It was during those years that a quiet obsession took root and grew with Terrell Owens. If I'm silent, I'll disappear. That fear wasn't about being hated. It was about not being seen. It drove him to always speak up, to react, to assert himself, even when it made others uncomfortable. To the outside world, it might look like noise, like an oversized ego. But for Terrell, it was a survival instinct formed very early, the instinct of a child who had learned that silence didn't bring safety. Most of America only knew Terrell Owens once he had become an elite athlete, a controversial figure, a name always caught between admiration and criticism. Very few people saw the child inside that man, the child who grew up in the void of an incomplete family, carrying a deep longing to be chosen, to be kept, to be recognized. What later got labeled as arrogance, rebellion, or being hard to manage was actually planted in those early years. Not because Terrell wanted to be the center of attention, but because he was terrified of being pushed to the edge again. And when he reached the major turning points in life, when football began to appear as an escape, that obsession didn't vanish. It simply changed form, cloaking itself in strength, speed, and the hunger to win. But deep down, Terrell Owens remained the child who once stood there, waiting for someone to call his name and say, "You are chosen." When he stepped out of a childhood, lacking protective arms, Terrell Owens didn't find salvation in words or comfort. He found it in the movement of his body. Football came to him not as a romantic dream, but as a survival instinct. On the field, for the first time, Terrell felt something he had never had before: eyes following him, his name being called, and the sense that his presence created a reaction in others. There, he was no longer the kid standing on the sidelines waiting to be noticed. He became the center of the moment. Football, in a very cruel yet very real way, became the only place where Terrell was clearly seen. Every catch for Terrell Owens was not just a technical act. It was a silent plea sent out into the air. "Look at me, stay with me just a little longer." When the ball stuck tight to his hands, when the crowd rose to its feet, Terrell felt something he had been missing for a very long time: validation. No one in the stadium knew that behind those powerful strides was a man searching for the feeling of being acknowledged, being chosen, being kept. But for Terrell, that was enough. In those few brief seconds, the roar of the crowd replaced the embraces he had never received. Terrell was not taught how to lose. No one sat him down and told him that failure is also part of being human. What he learned, from very early on, was a simple and brutal lesson: only when you stand out do you exist. Without the spotlight, you disappear. Sports, therefore, was not just a passion, it became the measure of his self-worth. Terrell began to tie his sense of who I am to whether others were looking his way. Every time he was cheered, he felt he had a place. Every time he was overlooked, the old fear rose again, reminding him that silence was always the greatest threat. In the world of football, where everything is measured in yards, touchdowns, and wins, Terrell learned to survive by becoming impossible to ignore. He ran faster, jumped higher, celebrated bigger. Not because he wanted to provoke, but because he feared that if he didn't make noise, he would return to that old place, where no one called his name. Love, something that should come from safe relationships, was gradually replaced by the roar of the crowd, and just like any other noise, that roar only existed in the moment. When it faded, the emptiness returned, deeper, colder. Terrell Owens gradually became a man of peak moments. He lived for the explosion, for the lights, for the immediate reaction of others. But what no one saw was the price he paid for that way of living. When your self-worth is tied to attention, every criticism becomes fatal. Every glance turned away feels like a betrayal. Terrell didn't overreact because he was arrogant. He overreacted because he was afraid. afraid of being forgotten, afraid of being pushed to the edge, afraid of returning to the feeling of the child who once stood there with no one choosing him. Football saved Terrell Owens from invisibility, but it also trapped him in an inescapable cycle. When all positive emotions came from the outside, he never learned how to comfort himself in silence. Victory brought a moment of relief, but defeat left a bottomless void. Terrell didn't know how to lose calmly, because losing meant the lights went out, and when the lights went out, he faced his primal fear again. Do I still exist in anyone's eyes? It was during this period that the psychological foundation of Terrell Owens was shaped in an irreversible way. Sports was not just a career path, it was the only emotional support system he had. Every route run was an effort to be kept. Every celebration was a way to remind himself that he was still being seen. And even though Terrell would later step onto bigger stages and face harsher pressures, the root of it all remained here. A man who learned to love himself through the gaze of others, because he was never taught that he deserved love even when no one was cheering. The day of the NFL draft did not bring Terrell Owens the glory he had once dreamed of during those sweaty years on the practice field. There was no early name call, no thunderous applause, no feeling that the entire room was waiting for him. When Terrell Owens's name was finally called in the third round, it wasn't a reward. It felt like a cold reminder that the system did not believe in him. To the NFL, he wasn't the anticipated star, not the face around which a story would be built from the beginning. He was just an acceptable choice, an option to experiment with, a name outside the priority zone. And in the silence of that moment, a quiet sentence was deeply engraved: "We don't believe in you." Terrell Owens entered the NFL, not with confidence backed by expectations, but with a silent anger. It wasn't an explosive anger or loud challenges. It was a quiet accumulated rage from years of being overlooked, undervalued, and seen as not enough. Being a third-round pick wasn't just a number. For Terrell, it was confirmation that even after running faster, jumping higher and catching better, it still wasn't enough for the system to bet on him. No one said outright that he didn't deserve it, but no one said he was the future either. And for someone who had tied his self-worth to attention, that lack of expectation hurt no differently than a denial of existence. With no lights, no cameras following, Terrell Owens stepped into the professional world as an outsider. In the NFL locker room, first-round picks were looked at differently. They were given patience, given chances, given time. Terrell, on the other hand, knew very well that every mistake would be remembered. Every moment of silence would push him further off the map. The NFL promised him nothing. It only cracked open a narrow door, and if he couldn't squeeze through, that door would close without explanation. It was at that point that the silent anger inside Terrell began to shape the way he existed in this league. Terrell didn't fight back with words. He fought back with obsessive effort. Every practice was a small trial, where he forced himself to prove that underestimating him was a mistake. Every route was an indictment sent to those who didn't believe. But the bitter irony was, the harder he tried to be recognized, the deeper Terrell was pushed into a defensive state. He didn't enter the NFL feeling welcomed. He entered with the mindset of someone always ready to be discarded. And when you live in that state for too long, you stop believing the system will ever treat you fairly. The third-round draft also planted a dangerous belief in Terrell Owens, that he was not allowed to slow down. Those picked early had the right to fail a few times. Terrell did not. He felt very clearly that his career could end before it even started, if he didn't make an immediate difference. The fear of being replaced, forgotten, pushed aside, made him carry an extreme intensity in every moment. What would later be called hard to manage or big ego, was at that time simply the survival response of someone who understood that trust is never given for free. In NFL history, many legends were drafted late, but not everyone carried the wound of being undervalued the way Terrell Owens did. For him, the draft was not just the start of a career, it was the repetition of a familiar pattern: chosen later, trusted less, required to prove more. The unspoken sentence, "We don't believe in you," was never read aloud, but it echoed long enough to shape the way Terrell saw this world. And from that very moment, he stepped into the NFL, not as someone granted an opportunity, but as someone standing on the edge of a cliff, where every step had to be strong enough to keep from falling. When Terrell Owens stepped foot with the San Francisco 49ers, he didn't arrive as a great hope the entire system nurtured, but as a piece on the board that needed to be tested. But in a short time, that experiment turned into a phenomenon. On the field, Owens exploded so fiercely that no one could pretend not to see him. He ran razor-sharp routes, made catches that seemed impossible, and kept appearing in the end zone as if that was where he belonged all along. Touchdown after touchdown, the numbers kept climbing, and opposing defenses gradually learned to beware of the name Terrell Owens. To the fans, he was a fearsome weapon. To the coaching staff, he was an effective tool. But in the locker room, everything was far more complicated. Owens quickly realized a painful paradox on the field. He was used to the fullest, but off the field, he wasn't truly understood. The game-changing plays that brought victories didn't lead to closeness. The shining moments didn't translate into trust. The locker room gradually grew cold, not because Owens lacked effort, but because he was different from what the collective expected. He spoke more, asked more questions, demanded more, and in an environment accustomed to silent order, that was seen as rebellion. Every suggestion Owens made about strategy, about how to run the offense, about how he could contribute more, was quickly labeled as an oversized ego. No one asked why he needed to be heard so badly. No one stopped to realize that behind those demands was a man who had entered the NFL with the silent anger of someone who had been undervalued. For Terrell, speaking up wasn't about controlling others, it was about affirming that he was still here, that his presence wasn't limited to just making catches. But in the 49ers locker room, where order was maintained through compliance, Owens's voice became something uncomfortable. On the field, everything still followed a ruthless trajectory. Every time the team needed a big play, eyes turned to Terrell Owens. He answered with performance, with plays that changed the course of the game. But as soon as the final whistle blew, the invisible distance reappeared clearly. Owens felt that he was needed, but not chosen. He was the one called upon when a win was required, but not the one sought out to build connection. And for a man who had grown up feeling no one ever chose him, that hurt more than any public criticism ever could. Terrell began to understand a bitter truth of the NFL. Being great doesn't automatically mean being accepted. Talent can secure you a spot on the field, but it doesn't guarantee a place in the heart of the collective. In that environment, asking questions is seen as a challenge, showing emotion is considered weakness, and wanting more recognition beyond stats is judged as selfish ambition. Owens, with all the unnamed wounds he carried, could not, and did not know how to shrink himself to fit in. He continued to be himself, continued to speak, continued to react, continued to express emotion in the most authentic way he knew. That very thing drove the locker room further away. The looks changed, small conversations gradually disappeared. Owens wasn't kicked out of the group, but he also wasn't pulled closer. He existed in a liminal state, good enough not to be discarded, but too different to be fully embraced. And when a person stays trapped in that state for too long, loneliness stops being a passing feeling and becomes part of their identity. Terrell Owens began to get used to celebrating alone, to standing amid the roar while still feeling empty. To the 49ers, Owens was a valuable asset, but to Owens, that period was the first lesson showing that the NFL wasn't a place for healing. It was a place that used to the maximum what you could give, but rarely asked what you needed to survive. Every misunderstanding, every time his words were twisted, the primal fear inside Terrell rose again. If I stay silent, I'll disappear. And so he kept speaking up, kept pushing himself forward, despite the growing price of ever clearer distance. When people look back at the 49ers era, many only see the spectacular touchdowns and the first controversies of a charismatic star, but beneath that surface was a man wrestling with an old unanswered question: will I be accepted, or am I only used when needed? And it was in that contradiction that Terrell Owens began to step deeper into a path where talent was no longer enough to save him from loneliness, and where every step forward on the field was followed by a step back in the human world around him. After the years with the 49ers, when Terrell Owens gradually understood that talent didn't automatically bring acceptance, a new defense mechanism began to form inside him. It wasn't innate arrogance, but the reflex of a man who had learned that if he didn't protect himself, he would keep getting hurt. Terrell Owens didn't wait for recognition to come naturally. He learned to strike first before being struck, to speak up before being sidelined. Owens's ego grew not to show off, but to build a wall to keep the world from getting too close to wounds that hadn't yet healed. Trash talk became a familiar armor. Every challenging word, every flamboyant celebration gesture, was a new layer of protection he put on to keep distance from the primal fear inside. On the field, he wasn't just facing opposing defenses, he was facing the memory of being abandoned, the feeling that if he didn't present himself as the strongest, the most formidable, he would be underestimated again. Trash talk wasn't gratuitous insult, it was the only language Owens knew to say that he was here and would not accept being ignored. But the NFL is a stage where every action is magnified. What to Owens was a survival reflex became evidence of arrogance to outsiders. The media began to define him with increasingly vicious words: selfish, disruptive, uncontrollable. Those labels clung tightly to Terrell Owens's image, obscuring all the quiet efforts behind them. No one asked why such a talented player always had to tense up so much. No one was curious about the pain that made him unable to stay silent. The story became much simpler when he was turned into the troublemaker, and America, which loves clear archetypes, quickly accepted that narrative. Owens felt very clearly the change in the way people looked at him. Teammates' eyes became wary. Analysts' comments carried more judgment than understanding. He was no longer seen as a player with personality, but as a problem to be managed. And when a person is labeled for too long, they are forced to live inside that label, whether they want to or not. The more Terrell Owens was seen as arrogant, the harder he had to appear tougher so he wouldn't be swallowed by feelings of weakness. His ego grew larger, not because he believed he was superior to everyone, but because he feared that if that ego collapsed, there would be nothing left to protect him from being hurt again. The most painful thing was that no one asked, "Why are you hurting?" The media didn't tell the story of a child who grew up lacking love. They didn't mention a young man who entered the NFL with the silent anger of someone who had been undervalued. They only saw a star who talked too much, celebrated too big, reacted too strongly. And in that simplification, the real Terrell Owens gradually faded away. He became a character everyone thought they understood, even though they had never truly listened. Every interview, every newspaper headline reinforced the image of Owens as someone at odds with the entire world. He reacted, the world reacted back, and the spiral just kept going. Terrell never learned how to stop, because stopping meant silence, and silence always brought back the feeling of disappearing. Instead of being supported to deal with his old wounds, he was pushed into the role of the villain, where every emotion was suspect. In that role, Owens both defended himself and hurt himself further, because every time he spoke up was also a time he dug the divide between himself and the collective even deeper. Terrell Owens's ego, therefore, was not a sign of conceit, but a symptom of a long-standing fear. It grew with him, becoming a barrier to keep others from touching wounds that had never been healed. But every barrier comes with a price. The stronger the defense, the more isolated Owens became. The harder he tried to prove he wasn't weak, the more he was misunderstood as someone who didn't need anyone. And in that paradox, Terrell Owens continued walking the path that both brought him glory and pushed him further away from understanding. At this stage of his life and career, Owens was no longer the boy seeking glances. He was a man fighting not to be hurt again. But the world didn't see that battle. They only saw a big ego, a controversial figure, and a star who seemingly refused to learn how to be quiet. No one asked why he was hurting, because asking that would force them to see the fragile human behind the arrogant armor. And Terrell Owens, accustomed to protecting himself, kept building the walls higher, unaware that those very walls were slowly locking him in a loneliness deeper than ever before. When Terrell Owens entered the absolute peak of his career, everything on the outside finally seemed to confirm what he had spent his whole life trying to prove. Pro Bowl after Pro Bowl, All-Pro became a familiar title, and his statistics began climbing to positions the NFL history books could no longer ignore. With each passing season, Owens moved closer to the group of the greatest wide receivers of all time. On paper, it was absolute success. It was the American dream retold, from the undervalued prospect to the undeniable star. But the bitter irony was that precisely when he achieved all of that, Terrell Owens realized nothing inside him had been healed. Success came in waves, but the emptiness grew with every season too. Each new accolade didn't bring relief. It only added more pressure to hold the position. Owens had no moment to breathe, no quiet space to believe he was enough. On the contrary, every win became a reminder that if he slowed down, if he loosened up, everything he had could disappear. For someone who grew up in fear of abandonment, the peak wasn't a place of rest, it was the most dangerous place. There, the fall would hurt more, and the loneliness would cut deeper. Owens stood at the top of the NFL, but the higher he climbed, the fewer people stood beside him. The locker room was no longer a place of sharing, it became a space of caution. Teammates looked at him with a mix of admiration and wariness. Coaches saw him as an asset to exploit, and a risk to control. The media saw him as a figure always ready to generate headlines. Amid all those gazes, Terrell Owens found no look that said, "We understand you." He had everything an athlete dreams of, but he lacked the most basic human need, the feeling of belonging. With each passing season, Owens grew more alone in his own success. Statistics couldn't talk to him. When night fell, trophies didn't sit beside him in the locker room when the door closed. Success, instead of becoming a refuge, turned into a gilded cage where every emotion was suspect. If he celebrated, people said he was showboating. If he got upset, people said he was disruptive. If he stayed silent, people suspected something was brewing. There was no way for Owens to exist at that peak without being misunderstood. Terrell Owens began to realize that his success was like a luxurious prison. On the outside it sparkled, admired, celebrated. But on the inside it imprisoned him in a role he couldn't escape. He had to always be strong, always sharp, always ready to confront. There was no room for vulnerability, no room to admit he was tired. And for someone who had never been taught how to love himself unconditionally, that prison closed tighter every day. At the peak, Owens no longer knew why he was playing football. At first, football was an escape from invisibility. Later, it became a way to be recognized. But now, having all the external recognition, he still didn't feel seen on the inside. Success didn't answer the old obsession. It didn't say he was good enough. It only said he was useful. And the difference between those two things was the gap Terrell Owens had never been able to cross. It was during this period that the contradictions within Terrell Owens became clearest. He was both an icon of victory and the embodiment of isolation. He was both hailed as a future legend and treated as a current problem. Every time he stepped on the field, he proved he deserved it. But every time he left the field, he faced the question no one answered. If I no longer create these moments, what do I have left? The peak, instead of bringing peace, only exposed more clearly the void Owens had carried since childhood. There was no easy escape for Terrell Owens at that point. He couldn't go back to being an anonymous player to find peace. He also couldn't go any further without sacrificing even more of his humanity. The peak of his career, therefore, was not a happy ending, but the point where the tragedy began to take clear shape. There, Terrell Owens stood alone, at the top of success, looking down at a world full of lights, and for the first time understood that light can also be a form of imprisonment. Success did not heal Terrell Owens. It only covered the wounds with a thicker layer of glory, making it harder for outsiders to see, and making it harder for him to touch them in order to heal. And as the following seasons continued to sweep him along, Owens carried a heavy truth. He had reached the peak, and still found no escape from his loneliness. The Super Bowl came to Terrell Owens not as a reward for his journey upward, but as a cruel test of fate. It should have been the purest moment of glory in an athlete's life, the place where all previous pain was repaid with the brilliant light of the biggest stage. But for Owens, the Super Bowl became the intersection between the desire to be recognized and the self-destruction of his body that he had almost accepted as inevitable. Just 7 weeks after a serious injury that, medically speaking, would sideline most athletes for a long time, Owens chose to return, not because he was fully ready, but because he didn't believe he had the right to wait. That decision to play wasn't driven by blind recklessness, but by a deep-seated fear that had followed him his entire life. If I don't show up, I'll be forgotten. At the peak of his career, amid the titles and historic numbers, Terrell Owens still carried the fragile feeling of a child who once wasn't called by name. The Super Bowl, for him, wasn't just the biggest game of his life, it was the final trial where he had to prove he deserved to be seen, remembered, and recognized as an indispensable part of NFL history. Pain became something he had to swallow. Owens didn't take the field with a healthy body, but with one held together by will and painkillers. Every route run was a challenge to his own limits. Every cut was a small knife into areas that hadn't yet recovered. But on his face, there was no hesitation. Terrell Owens understood that no one rewards weakness in this world. He had learned that lesson very early, and now, in the biggest game of his life, he applied it to the extreme. Playing in the Super Bowl with an unhealed body wasn't the heroic act many would later want to tell it as. It was the clearest manifestation of a man who believed his worth had to be purchased with pain. Owens didn't believe that being excellent was enough. He believed he had to pay an extra price, endure more, sacrifice more, so the world would finally look at him differently. And in that twisted logic, self-destruction became a form of silent pleading. On the field, Owens still did what he always did best: show up at the right moment, make the crucial catches, create the difference. To the viewers, it was the performance of a star who refused to yield. To Terrell, it was proof that he was willing to trade himself away to avoid being forgotten. Every successful play didn't bring a sense of victory, it brought temporary relief. They're looking at me. But that feeling was so fragile that just one moment of silence was enough for the fear to return. The Super Bowl ended, but the story didn't close with release. No miracle happened to heal the wounds that had been pushed beyond their limits. Terrell Owens left the field with a more exhausted body and a heavier mind. He had done everything he could, even more than he should have, but the recognition he sought still didn't arrive the way he wanted. The praise was quickly overshadowed by debates, opposing viewpoints, and questions about who he was as a person. Physical pain would pass, but the mental disappointment stayed. In that Super Bowl, Owens sent a message he probably never wanted to admit out loud: if I don't endure pain, I'll be forgotten. That was the cruelest message an athlete could carry. It turned every injury into an investment, every ache into proof of existence. And when a person lives too long with that belief, they no longer know how to stop. Rest becomes suspicious. Self-care is seen as weakness. Self-destruction becomes the only way to keep being seen. The Super Bowl, which should have been the moment Owens stood in full light, instead became the clearest evidence of his tragedy. He had sacrificed his body to trade for a few hours on the biggest stage, but the price he paid lasted far longer. Those wounds weren't just in the muscles or ligaments, they were carved deep into how he saw himself. Terrell Owens continued to believe he had to endure more than others to be recognized as equal. And while the world looked back at that Super Bowl as proof of resilience, few stopped to ask what had driven a man to the point of playing while still injured. Few realized that behind the image of stubborn fighting was a fear that had never been soothed. The Super Bowl didn't heal Terrell Owens. It only exposed more clearly a painful truth in his quest for recognition. He had learned to hurt himself before he could even think of protecting himself. And from that moment onward, every step forward in Owens's career carried the long shadow of sacrifice, where pain was no longer unexpected. It was the condition for being remembered. After the Super Bowl, Terrell Owens didn't step out of the lights with release. He stepped into an even harsher phase, the phase where his talent was still needed, but the person he was gradually got excluded from the conversation. When Owens joined the Philadelphia Eagles, it should have been a new chapter of hope. On the field, he continued to do what the entire league knew he could: make a difference. The game-changing catches, the numbers still at their peak, the moments that, if you only looked at the stat sheet, would make people think everything was going the right way. But behind those victories, the relationship between Owens and the collective began to crack in the familiar way. He was no longer seen as an individual who needed to be understood, but as a variable that needed to be controlled. Each day that passed with the Eagles felt like a silent negotiation. Terrell Owens still showed up at the right moments when the team needed him, still answered with performance, but the atmosphere around him grew heavier. Conversations no longer got to the substance. They revolved around how to manage him. Differences in opinion were quickly escalated into conflict. And in a system accustomed to categorizing people simply cooperative or not, Owens was gradually placed in the dangerous drawer. His talent was never doubted, but his personality was seen as irreconcilable. From there a new label formed: unsalvageable. Owens felt that change very clearly, not through direct words, but through the looks, the behind-the-scenes decisions, the meetings he wasn't invited to. He was still a key player on the field, but off the field, he became a topic to avoid. That feeling was painfully familiar, being used, but not being kept. And for a man who had lived his entire life in fear of abandonment, constantly being placed in that position was like rubbing salt into a wound that had never healed. When Owens moved to the Dallas Cowboys, hope flickered again, though very fragile. Dallas was a big stage, a place where legends were worshipped, an opportunity for Owens to prove that everything before had just been a misunderstanding. And once again he didn't disappoint anyone professionally. His performance remained elite. The plays still carried his unmistakable signature, but like a repeating curse, the relationship between Owens and the collective continued sliding into a dead end. With the Cowboys, everything happened more subtly, less noisy, but no less cruel. Owens was no longer spoken of as a player who needed development, but as a problem that needed solving. Every reaction of his was examined under a microscope. Every emotion was interpreted negatively. What to Owens was an attempt to communicate became to others evidence of trouble. And when a person is viewed as a problem for too long, they gradually lose the right to be seen as a human being. The most painful thing was at this stage, Terrell Owens was no longer a young impulsive player. He was a seasoned athlete who had proven his worth at every level. But the old wounds combined with the system's lack of patience made every relationship he entered carry the seed of collapse from the start. Not because Owens didn't want to fit in, but because he didn't know how to become invisible to please others. He had lived too long with the belief that silence meant disappearance, so when asked to be quiet to be easier to manage, Owens simply couldn't comply. Performance remained at its peak, but trust was gone. Every team Owens wore the jersey for became a broken relationship, where both sides carried disappointment. To the teams, Owens was a great talent but a high risk. To Owens, the teams were places where he was needed but not accepted. That loop kept repeating until it shaped the way the entire NFL viewed him. Terrell Owens was no longer seen as a complex individual with a history of trauma and a desire to be understood. He became a brand of trouble, a file to be carefully considered, a problem more than a person. When the system began operating that way, every door closed faster. No need for a major mistake, no need for a shocking incident. Just the collective memory of previous broken relationships was enough to make teams hesitate. Owens felt that change in the air of the league. The calls dwindled. Opportunities no longer came as they once did. He could still play at a high level, but the trust placed in him had run dry. And in the NFL world, where trust matters no less than talent, that was nearly a final sentence. Terrell Owens wasn't discarded because he was no longer good. He was discarded because the system decided he wasn't worth the emotional investment. When a person is labeled unsalvageable, every attempt to change is viewed with suspicion. Every explanation is seen as an excuse, and every silence is interpreted as hidden danger. That is a complete dead end, where you no longer have the right to make mistakes, but also no longer have the chance to be understood. At this stage of his career, Terrell Owens wasn't just facing a decline in opportunities, he was facing a deeper pain, the feeling that the entire league had stopped seeing him as a human being capable of connection. He was reduced to a problem to be handled, a risk to be avoided, a story teams didn't want to tell again. And as the doors kept slamming shut, Owens began to understand that the greatest tragedy wasn't losing his place on the field, but losing the right to be seen as a human being capable of change, growth, and forgiveness. When the doors in the NFL began closing one by one, Terrell Owens hadn't even had time to find a new foothold before he was pushed into an even colder space, the space of mainstream media. If the locker room was where he was seen as a problem to be handled, then the media became a trial without a lawyer, where the verdict was delivered every day, without needing to hear a defense. Terrell Owens was no longer mentioned as an athlete with a complex journey, but as a convenient negative symbol for every story about ego, trouble, and failure in people management. American media, accustomed to clear archetypes, quickly turned Owens into a one-dimensional character. Every action of his was placed in the same interpretive frame: selfish, disruptive, incapable of change. A person with depth, with a history of trauma, with internal conflicts, was reduced to a caricature, an exaggerated drawing, where every line was bent to serve the easiest story to tell. The on-field achievements didn't disappear, but they were pushed to the margins, giving way to sensational headlines. The name Terrell Owens gradually stopped being tied to football and became tied to repeated negative keywords. The cruelest part of this trial was that Owens had no right to tell his own story. Every time he spoke up, his words were edited, interpreted, placed in unfavorable context. He fought back not because he wanted to provoke, but because he couldn't stand being spoken for. But in the logic of the media, that resistance only became more evidence to reinforce the pre-built negative image. The more he spoke, the more he was hated. The more he stayed silent, the more his story was written by others the way they wanted. Terrell Owens was trapped in an incapable loop. If he spoke up to explain, people said he didn't know how to self-reflect. If he pushed back, people said he couldn't accept the truth. If he tried to change his image, people questioned his motives. There was no scenario that allowed him to be seen as a human being struggling with himself. The media didn't need complex truth. They needed a simple symbol to represent everything that was wrong. And Owens, with his history of conflict and strong personality, became the perfect choice. The truth gradually had no place left in the story about Terrell Owens. The moments when he tried to connect, the times he admitted mistakes, the rare glimpses of vulnerability, all were deemed unworthy of notice. They didn't fit the already framed image. Instead, even the smallest gesture could be blown up into proof of his unchanging nature. A human being was stripped of the right to evolve in the public eye, frozen in a role he never chose. Owens felt this shift very clearly. He was no longer in dialogue with specific people, but with an invisible wall of public opinion. Any attempt to explain himself would hit that wall and bounce back even harder. For someone who grew up in fear of disappearing, being spoken for was even more painful than silence. He still appeared in headlines, but no longer existed as a real person. It was the most distorted form of existence, constantly mentioned, but never truly heard. This trial without a lawyer didn't just affect Terrell Owens's image, it eroded the will inside him. When you're judged every day by people who've never sat down to ask what you're carrying, belief in fairness slowly crumbles. Owens didn't lose faith in his talent, but he began to lose faith in the possibility of being understood. And when a person believes they will never be understood, they either withdraw or fight back harder. Owens chose to fight back, because silence always brought back the original fear of vanishing. In the public eye, Terrell Owens became a character everyone thought they already knew completely. But that very knowing was the most dangerous thing. It eliminated the need to learn more, erased curiosity about context, and erased the capacity for empathy. A complex human being was turned into a simple cautionary tale. Don't be like him. And in that story, Owens was no longer the athlete who sacrificed his body for recognition, no longer the child who was abandoned, no longer a person searching for connection. He was just a label. At this stage, the tragedy of Terrell Owens was no longer on the field. It was about the right to define himself. The media, with its power to shape collective memory, took that right away and replaced it with a more convenient image. Owens fought back, and the price was ever-widening hatred. But if he didn't fight back, he would have to accept being erased from his own life story. Caught between those two cruel choices, Terrell Owens kept walking, carrying a bitter truth. In a world where image matters more than the person, truth can be pushed out of the light, and one individual's pain can be turned into collective entertainment. After the media's trial without a lawyer, Terrell Owens stepped into the cruelest moment in the life of any professional athlete, The moment when the very system he had given everything to turned its back in absolute silence. No phone call, no press conference, no ceremonial thank you. The NFL, the league that had exploited his talent, his body, and even his personality for years, simply moved on without looking back. Terrell Owens wasn't announced as retired. He was forgotten. To outsiders, it might have looked like a natural transition. An aging player with too many controversies, no longer a fit. But for Owens, this wasn't an orderly end. It was a funeral without ceremony. An ending where the door closed without a sound, where the lights went out without announcement. No team called to say they had considered him. No one said he had a respectable career. There was no final moment for him to know how he left in the league's eyes. For an athlete, the ritual of departure isn't just formality. It's the confirmation that the years of sacrifice were real. It's the moment to close the chapter, to understand that despite the conflicts and controversies, the journey was still recognized as part of the shared history. But Terrell Owens had none of that. He woke up in a new season and realized the phone didn't ring. Training camps opened, contracts were signed, and he stood outside, with no explanation. The greatest pain wasn't in no longer being able to play, it was in how everything ended. Owens wasn't ready to leave. He still believed he could contribute. His body, though carrying many injuries, hadn't given up. But the NFL decided for him, not with an official announcement, but with prolonged silence. And that silence, for a man who had feared disappearance his entire life, was crueler than any outright rejection. There was no farewell ceremony, no teammates' embrace, no stadium standing for one final ovation. Just long days when Owens wondered if everything he had done had ever really existed. For an athlete, this is a funeral without mourners. You know a part of you has died, but no one comes to acknowledge the loss. No one says goodbye. No one stops to look at you one last time. Terrell Owens was not given the chance to control the ending of his own story. He wasn't allowed to say thank you, nor to say goodbye. The NFL kept moving, kept creating new stars, new stories, while Owens became a hard-to-name void. When a system that big turns its back, it doesn't just take away your job, it takes away your identity. Because for many years, football wasn't just Owens's profession, it was how he existed, how he was seen. In the days that followed, Owens had to face a brutal question: who am I when there is no NFL, no training schedule, no locker room, no cheers from the stands? The silence after being discarded is not rest. It's like being pushed out of a party you helped build, only to find you're not invited at the end. And in that silence, every old wound rises again, abandoned once more. No explanation, no one choosing him. This professional death had no ritual to help Owens accept it. No closing moment to let him know he had been recognized, even once. Instead, there was the feeling of being erased from the present, even though his past still lived in the numbers and the footage. A painful paradox. History still holds his name, but the present no longer needs him. For Terrell Owens, this wasn't just the NFL turning its back. This was the moment his deepest, most primal fear became reality. Not being criticized, not being hated, but being forgotten in silence. And in that funeral without ceremony, Owens was forced to stand alone, facing the question he had spent his life avoiding. If there is no field left to prove I exist, do I still have any value? It was at this point that the tragedy of Terrell Owens reached its deepest depth. There was no longer a clear enemy to confront, no longer media to fight back against, only absence, a prolonged, cold, and absolute absence. And for an athlete, there is no more painful ending than leaving without being seen off, without being called by name, as though he had never been there at all. After the funeral without ceremony that the NFL gave him, Terrell Owens stepped into a state of suspended existence, where his career had ended but had never truly been closed. There was no official moment to name that departure, no retirement announcement heard amid thunderous applause, no final sideline for him to cross with a sense of completion. Owens left the field in silence, carrying an unfinished story that no one helped him bring to an end. That silence was not peace. It was a prolonged void, where every passing day reminded him that a part of himself had been taken away without any farewell ritual. For an athlete, retirement is usually a prepared process, acknowledged, recognized as a completed journey. But for Owens, it was an abrupt cut. He didn't know the exact day he last was an NFL player. There was no timestamp to say from here on, everything is different. Just one morning waking up and realizing the door had closed at some point. Every NFL Sunday became a fresh cut. The opening music on television, the images of packed stadiums, young wide receivers running routes with eagerness that had never been worn down, all of it felt like a bitter reminder. Owens didn't just watch football. He faced a version of himself that had been left behind. Every beautiful catch was a wordless question. Why is there no longer room for me? Every celebration was a stabbing memory of the years when he once stood there, once lived for those moments. Without closure, Owens could not fully move into a new chapter. He was not permitted to let go, because there had never been a moment to hold on one last time. His career didn't end with a period. It ended with an endless ellipsis, and in that ellipsis, every old wound returned with full intensity. The feeling of abandonment that had shaped his childhood rose again as though it had never left. No one called, no one chose, no one said he had been enough. Owens began to understand that the greatest pain wasn't losing the field, it was losing the right to tell his story his way. When there is no ritual of ending, memories cannot be sorted, success and failure tangled together, moments of glory and moments of misunderstanding overlapping without resolution. He didn't know whether to feel pride or regret, didn't know whether to remember or forget. That ambiguity ate away at his spirit, making every passing day feel like an unfinished conversation with the past. In the silence, Owens faced himself in the way he had avoided his entire life. No more locker room to distract, no more training schedule to fill the time, no more games to turn emotion into action, only long evenings where memories flooded in freely. He remembered the early days entering the NFL with the silent anger of someone undervalued, remembered the peak seasons when he stood alone at the top, remembered the Super Bowl where he sacrificed his body to be recognized, and then remembered the nameless, dateless moment when his career was left behind without a single goodbye. The feeling of abandonment returned as fully as in childhood, the same emptiness, the same simmering question, did I ever really belong anywhere? Owens realized that throughout his career he had always fought not to disappear, but in the end what he feared most happened in the quietest way. No one pushed him out, they simply moved on without needing him anymore. And in that world, there was no room for resistance, because there was no specific target to confront. Retiring in silence gave Owens no chance to heal. It gave him no moment to pause, look around, and say goodbye. It only forced him to learn how to live with a part of his life that was never properly closed. Every NFL Sunday continued to arrive. Every new season continued to begin. And Owens continued to find ways to exist in a world that had grown accustomed to not having him. At this stage, Terrell Owens was no longer an athlete fighting the system or the media. He was a man trying to piece himself back together from the fragments of a career that had never been properly ended. The enveloping silence was not a sign of acceptance. It was an unfilled void. And in that void, Owens continued to carry the old pain, no longer covered by cheers or stadium lights. Only a human being remained, standing between past and present, trying to find a way to keep living when the old chapter had ended without ever truly closing. After his career closed in silence, Terrell Owens didn't step into a lighter life. He fell straight into another battlefield, one without spectators, without referees, and without a final whistle. His personal life began to crumble in a quiet but persistent way, and this time, there was no field to escape into whenever things became too heavy. Terrell Owens had once known how to become an elite athlete, but he had never been taught how to become a complete father. Money, which had once flowed into his life as a reward for years of sacrificing his body, gradually became a source of conflict. Child support disputes arose not just as legal matters, but as painful reminders that success on the field did not automatically translate into stability at home. Owens, who had once believed that giving his best would make everything fall into place, began to realize that private life required a completely different set of skills, consistent presence, patience, and the ability to listen that he had never learned. The distance from his children grew with time, not because of a lack of love, but because Owens didn't know how to bridge the gaps created by his own wounds. He had grown up without a father figure to model after. No memories of evenings spent being heard, no experience of unconditional embrace. When he became a father, he carried that emptiness with him, and in his confusion, he repeated what was most familiar: emotional absence, even though he never wanted to. Owens once admitted, in rare moments of absolute honesty, that he had failed in his role as a father, not because he didn't love his children, but because he didn't know how to love in the way they needed. The arguments over money, the prolonged misunderstandings, and the involvement of the law made an already fragile relationship even more strained. Each time, Owens faced a familiar feeling: being judged, being evaluated, being seen as not good enough. But this time, the pain was far deeper, because it concerned his own flesh and blood. In his career, Owens could fight back, could speak up, could use performance to prove his worth. But in his family, there are no stat sheets to make up for anything. No Pro Bowl or All-Pro can replace the presence of a father. Owens gradually understood that the unhealed wounds from his childhood were repeating in a cruel cycle. He had once been the child who felt he was never chosen, and now, in his deepest fear, he worried that his own children were carrying a similar feeling. The generational cycle of trauma became painfully clear. A man who grew up lacking love, entered the world with silent anger, used talent to seize attention, and then, when the lights went out, discovered he had no tools to build lasting connection. Owens didn't intentionally hurt his children, but not knowing how to show up can cause damage no less than complete abandonment. And that realization weighed heavily on him every day. Money, once seen as the solution to every problem, couldn't buy back the closeness that had been lost. Child support payments, big or small, couldn't replace the missed conversations, the milestones of growth that Owens wasn't there for. He began to understand that while he had spent his whole life trying to prove his worth by being seen, what his children needed was a quiet but consistent presence. That gap created a lingering guilt, a regret that was hard to name. At this stage of his life, Terrell Owens was no longer fighting the media or the NFL. He was fighting himself, with the question of whether he could break the cycle of trauma. Admitting failure in his family was the hardest thing for a man who had spent his life resisting the image of a loser, but that very admission also opened a fragile possibility: the possibility of change. Owens couldn't go back and start over, but he could learn how not to keep causing hurt. The breakdown of his personal life is not a separate chapter from Terrell Owens's career. It is the direct consequence of a life lived in defense, where success was used to cover gaps that were never filled. And when the stage lights went out, those gaps became clearer than ever. In the money, in the disputes, in the distance from his children, Owens saw the reflection of his own childhood. A painful loop, but also a reminder that if he didn't confront and change, the trauma would continue to be passed on, from one generation to the next. When the announcement finally came that Terrell Owens had been elected to the Hall of Fame, it should have been the moment to close all the controversies. An official, overdue but undeniable recognition for one of the greatest wide receivers in NFL history. But instead of bringing healing, that honor exposed yet another deep crack. Terrell Owens was honored, but the feeling of victory didn't arrive, because for him, something that comes too late rarely retains its full meaning. The Hall of Fame recognizes the numbers, the plays, the glorious seasons. It records the career on paper, but it cannot turn back time to soothe the years when Owens was rejected, doubted, sidelined while he still hungered to play. This honor couldn't give him a proper goodbye from the NFL, couldn't fill the long Sundays when he watched football as an outsider, and couldn't repair the feeling of being discarded in silence. Owens's decision not to attend the official induction ceremony shocked the public. To many, it was an arrogant act, an unnecessary refusal. But for Terrell Owens, it wasn't a gesture of defiance. It was the final act of resistance from a man who was tired of playing the role others expected. He didn't want to stand on a podium built by the same system that had once turned its back on him, not because he didn't value the honor, but because he couldn't pretend that all the wounds had been healed just because of a bronze plaque. The honor arrived, but it brought no reconciliation. Owens understood very well the historical value of the Hall of Fame, but he also understood that the title couldn't replace the years when he needed to be heard, and no one listened. It couldn't make up for being seen as a problem, instead of a human being, and it certainly couldn't erase the memory of having to walk away from the NFL on his own without any farewell ritual. That act of resistance, in the end, wasn't one of pride. It was a sign of exhaustion. Owens had fought too long to be seen correctly, to tell his own story, to not be reduced to a distorted image. When the Hall of Fame finally called his name, he no longer had the energy to stand in a ceremony that felt incomplete to him. Instead of seeking collective applause, Owens chose a quieter path, where he could retain the last bit of control over his own story. The Hall of Fame honors the career, but it doesn't heal the man. It confirms that Terrell Owens deserves a place in football history, but it cannot deny that history left far too many wounds. The title doesn't patch the years of rejection. It doesn't erase the feeling that recognition came after everything most important had already been taken away. At this moment, Terrell Owens is no longer seeking forgiveness from the NFL or the public. He is only seeking honesty with himself. And in that honesty, he accepts that some honors come too late to bring peace. The Hall of Fame writes his name in gold letters, but his heart carries scars that no ceremony can erase. This is not a triumphant ending, but a chapter that closes quietly, where honor and pain coexist, not blending, just standing side by side as two sides of the same life. At age 52, Terrell Owens no longer stands on the field, no longer hears the roar calling his name, no longer sees slow-motion frames glorifying every stride. But he also doesn't disappear. Owens continues to live in a quiet state, where there is no full redemption, no pre-written ending to soothe the pain. The Terrell Owens of today is not a symbol of victory, but the image of a man who still exists after the lights have gone out. Every morning, Owens trains alone, not to prove anything to the NFL, and not to wait for a call that will never come. He trains as a survival habit. The body that was once exploited to exhaustion now operates in silence, no cameras, no stands. The runs, the weight lifts, the drops of sweat falling onto the gym floor no longer carry the meaning of performance. They are simply Owens's way of reminding himself that he is still here, that the body once pushed to its limits has not yet surrendered. Without the lights, Owens is forced to face himself in the rawest way. No more star role to cover the inner gaps, no more media to blame, no more system to resist, just one man with memories longer than any stat sheet. The years of abandonment, the peak seasons that were lonely, the Super Bowl played with an unhealed body, the doors slamming shut, the career ending without ceremony, the broken family, and a Hall of Fame that brought no healing. All of it exists side by side inside him, unresolved, unerased. Owens today no longer seeks recognition from the outside, but that does not mean he has been healed. The old wounds are still there, sometimes simmering, sometimes flaring up fiercely. There are days he feels strong, believing he has come far enough not to be defined by the past anymore. And there are also days when the memories return intact, reminding him that some pain does not disappear just because time passes. Continuing to live does not always mean victory. Sometimes it simply means not collapsing. Terrell Owens does not have a beautiful redemption story to tell. There is no moment of enlightenment that suddenly makes everything easy. His life does not bend into a perfect lesson. Instead, it is uneven, full of contradictions, and leaves more questions than answers. Owens has learned to live with the truth that he was not fully embraced when he left the field, and perhaps he has also learned to accept that not every pain needs a clear ending to become meaningful. At age 52, Terrell Owens is no longer an NFL player, no longer the center of controversy, no longer the icon the media wanted to distort. He is simply a man who continues to walk with what he has. There are solo training sessions. There are long evenings when the past knocks at the door. There are rare moments of peace when he realizes that still standing tall is itself a form of quiet victory. The ending of this story does not bring full comfort. It does not promise that everything will eventually be okay. It only affirms one simple but painful thing: not every legend is embraced when they leave the field. Some leave to applause, some leave in silence, but every legend, no matter how it ends, carries a pain that deserves to be heard. And Terrell Owens, at age 52, needs no more titles to prove that. He only needs his story to be told fully, not reduced, not hastily judged, as a human being who lived, sacrificed, and still exists amid wounds that have never been healed. The story of Terrell Owens leaves a profoundly sad echo, because this is not just the tragedy of a sports star, but the tragedy of a human being who grew up and matured feeling left behind. From a child who was never called by name, lacking the image of a father, Owens entered the NFL with a hunger to be seen, to be recognized, and he achieved what very few Americans can, becoming one of the greatest wide receivers in history, with Pro Bowls, All-Pros, a Super Bowl, and finally the Hall of Fame. But ironically, those achievements could not heal the central wound inside him. The image of Owens taking the field in the Super Bowl just 7 weeks after injury is a haunting detail. It was not just competitive spirit, it was the silent self-destruction of a man who believed that if he didn't endure pain, he would be forgotten. Then came the years of being labeled a problem to be managed with the Eagles and Cowboys, when his performance remained elite but his humanity was reduced. The NFL, turning its back in silence, with no call, no farewell ceremony, turned his career into a funeral without mourners, a particularly brutal pain for any athlete. Even when honored by the Hall of Fame, Owens was not healed. His decision not to attend the official ceremony showed the exhaustion of a man who had waited too long for recognition. His personal life crumbled, disputes with his children, and the admission that he failed as a father revealed that the generational cycle of trauma continued, despite money and fame. The lesson for the American people from this story is very clear: talent and success cannot replace understanding, and systems, whether sports, business, or society, can create legends, but can just as easily wound the human being behind the spotlight. Not every legend is embraced when they leave the field, but a more humane society is one that knows how to listen to their pain before it's too late. If the story of Terrell Owens touched you, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue listening to the journeys behind the spotlight of legends. Thank you for staying until the very last minute, and see you in the next video, where pains that have never been named will continue to be told fully and fairly.